Welcome everyone to today's Edison Electric Institute webinar, Innovating in Symphony, Orchestrating a New Consumer-Centric Energy Future. My name is Vanessa Ferrero and I'm a manager for international programs at EEI. Today's discussion features speakers from Vector Limited, who will discuss their innovative strategy for the future. Before we get started, I want to go over some housekeeping items and remind everyone of EEI's compliance with antitrust laws. As you all know, EEI and its members are committed to full compliance with all laws and regulations and to maintaining the highest ethical standards in the way we do business. This commitment includes strict compliance with federal and state antitrust laws. Throughout this session, we encourage you to join in the conversation by submitting questions using the chat feature. The webinar presentation and recording will be made available to all attendees after today's session. Now I will turn this over to Lawrence Jones, Vice President for International Programs at Edison Electric Institute, who will moderate today's session.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning, good afternoon, and actually good evening, because I did see we have a participant on the call from Germany. So I should say good evening to that individual. Thanks, everyone, and welcome to this EI International Program webinar. We are delighted today to have an opportunity to talk about a topic that I know is very key for our industry, which is that of innovation. And we're delighted that the speakers today will be Simon McKenzie, who is the CEO of Vector Limited, and Nikhil Ravashankar, who is the Chief Digital Officer, also of Vector, based in Auckland, New Zealand. What is interesting is I was just talking to Sandra, and to Simon and Nikhil before we started, that it was only 8 months ago we were together in Auckland when I visited them for our regular member meeting that we do around the world. And little did we know that in October we'll have to be constrained to having this sort of a dialogue. But I think this just tells us that we're living in interesting times, and the fact that we can even have this conversation is a testament to the impact that innovation has had on the sector, but also more broadly on society. So this webinar is going to focus on innovation specifically. They will be talking about their approach, their strategy around becoming a consumer-centric organization as we head to a much more consumer-centric world. So to kick things off, Nikhil will give a quick presentation, and then we'll open it up for question and answer with Simon and Nikhil. So I'll first hand it over to Simon, and then Nikhil, if they want to say some opening words before we kick off with Nikhil's presentation. Simon, any opening remarks?
No, look, just great to be with you, and thanks very much for the invite, Lawrence, and really appreciate the chance to just share our perspectives. Obviously, it's a perspective that we have, and it's not necessarily right for everyone, but it's certainly just how we approach life. So Nicola and I are going to basically tag team on this presentation. We really welcome discussion at the end of it. And, you know, we're always open to how we can collaborate with other parties if there's other information that would be, you know, people would appreciate. The other side for us is really important to just, you know, pass on our thoughts to everyone around the world, and hope you're managing through these COVID times. New Zealand's obviously been in a relatively good space compared to other areas, but you know, I think we all face new challenges in this new world, and in particular, you know, obviously we can't connect directly, but this is a great forum to be able to have that connection, which is something very critical from our perspective about collaboration and connection with like-minded parties. So thanks very much for the opportunity, Lawrence and Vanessa, for setting this up.
Well, thank you so much. So Nick, over to you.
Yep, so I'm going to just kind of introduce, and then we'll get into some of the areas where we're really focused on innovation and customer focus. And so, you know, first and foremost, just anchoring where we are. Some of you may have been to New Zealand, but you know, we basically operate out of Auckland in New Zealand, which is New Zealand's largest city. I'll just go back one slide, Nicole. And just put that in perspective, that's a shot of the harbour of Auckland with what's known as the Auckland Harbour Bridge. The relevance of that is that we actually, all the lights on the bridge is a project that we put in place to light up the Auckland Harbour Bridge. There's something like 90,000 LEDs on that. But the relevance of that is it's a showcase from our perspective of what the future can look like. So all the lights are individually controllable. We run light shows with it and use it for special events, such as celebrating what's known as Waitangi Day here, which is to celebrate New Zealand's foundations and other events as we go through the year. So there's multiple colours that obviously can arise from that, but the reality is it's also a representation of the future, given that it's powered by solar and battery and peer-to-peer charging. And so that's just for us a kind of an anchoring point about where we operate in, primarily in New Zealand, and then also how it's a representation of the future and the connection for the community. Just quickly touching on, next slide, with regards to Vector as a business, we are listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange with a market capitalisation of 4.4 billion. One of the interesting features, and I think it's very relevant to the point about our customer focus, is the majority owner at 75.1% is our community trust called Entrust. It basically is the major shareholder, with the remaining 24.9% being obviously other shareholders, basically through trading on the exchange. And what is very relevant with that is that means that we have a really good connection between a customer and community, but also the disciplines of being a listed company. So that balance has been really beneficial to us. The way in which the model operates is that the 75% shareholders being in trust are basically elected on a 3-yearly basis, and they represent the consumers of the south side of the Auckland Harbour, being the old Auckland Electric Power Board network. So that then brings a lot of basically community and customer views through that channel into our organisation. But also we distribute our dividends back to them, and over about the last 10 years we've distributed back over $1 billion in dividends, which gets paid out to each individual connected customer in that part of our business, which is roughly about 400,000 people, and they on average get around $300 a year as a dividend back individually. So a nice connection there from a community and business perspective. We operate across New Zealand in other areas of our business. Our regulated networks just sit across the Auckland region, whereas we operate other assets in our portfolio across New Zealand, Australia and the Pacific. We have the largest energy portfolio of business in New Zealand. And as I said, the model creates that natural alignment between customer and shareholder. So our businesses split roughly 60% to 40%. We think of our business as a portfolio in the energy sector and energy and infrastructure. As you'll see there, we have Vector metering, smart metering rollout business. We deployed significant amount of those right across New Zealand, something like 65% of the New Zealand market deploying smart metering. In Australia, on gas is gas distribution, LPG, gas trading. Fibre is a telecommunications fibre business operating all over Auckland. PowerSmart is our technology, new technology such as solar and battery installations, primarily in the Pacific, but with also in more recent times some large installations in New Zealand. Vector Technology Services is an area of the business which Nickel took to, but it's a new division that we have very much focused on providing the digital solutions for the future. And then we have our electricity and gas business. Next slide. Our vision is really just simply, we're all about how we create a new energy future. So it starts from a perspective that, you know, people talk about disruption. We look at disruption as an opportunity, not a threat. We look at how, because of our ownership structure and our belief and mindset, given the challenges of affordability, decarbonisation, the challenges with regards to the long life nature of our assets and the stranding risk of those with the rapid increase in new technology, how do we reinvent and reimagine the whole energy system and actually deploy new solutions into that to give customers choice, to manage the risk of, you know, asset stranding, not actually investing in solutions that may become redundant in, you know, 10, 15 years, but also providing choices to customers through things such as electric vehicle charging infrastructure, solar and battery, as many of you are as well. And so for us, that's a really critical part that is, I guess, the uniting vision for all of our parts of our business across the portfolio of assets we have. Bringing that to life, we call it our Symphony strategy, and we'll touch on this in a little bit more in detail soon, but our Symphony strategy is what we actually use to how we consider how we'll get to that vision of creating a new energy future. So the three key elements can be broken down into a real focus on customer data and analytics. We have obviously a huge connection with regards to our customer base, but that customer base is not just the end-use consumers, it's also customers such as retailers who we provide metering services to, we provide our regulated network services to, we provide gas, we provide telecommunication, and solar and a whole range of other services. So the point with regards to this is ensuring that customers are at the centre of our thinking, and to actually really support that and drive that in the business is a massive investment in data and insights and analytics. And we'll show you some of those examples and how they actually interlaced into our strategies, such as how we get to Symphony versus other options. The other important point with data analytics, which I'd bring together, is this is just not analysing what we would classically say is typical electricity, distribution information, such as demand and consumption and so forth. It goes much wider and deeper into consumer behaviours. It goes into, locational issues. It goes into future trends and how we may model those given insights from other jurisdictions. The other aspect is bringing together basically digital platforms and the platforms that are required to actually not only coordinate but orchestrate networks of the future and the solutions that we're providing to customers, and how do we actually optimize using those platforms to deliver more capital efficient outcomes and or solutions to customers. And then largely the energy assets ourselves, what are those energy assets that we want to invest in? And rather than just recreating and rebuilding the old through a centralized mindset, how do we actually build assets that actually fit with the customer needs, with those objectives of customer focus? How are they going to contribute to decarbonising the future? How are they going to contribute to affordability? How will those assets also deliver on aspects such as customer choice and solutions? So all those three elements also then largely from our model inform us about what positions we want to take on issues such as regulation, policy development, and essentially the social compact, which is essentially the social license to operate. And how do we actually connect with customers? What's our brand positioning? What's our kind of values that have to align with the strategy? Culture, capability, and collaboration is obviously hugely important to turn the culture around. And we've been on this journey for probably nearly 10 years now, really focused on customer, but also really importantly, collaboration, because down here in New Zealand, our mindset is that we are remote from a lot of other businesses. We're also remote from a lot of technology developers. So actually having the right culture and the mindset and actually going out and doing, new innovative things, actually putting in place new solutions rather than talking about them is really fundamental to our perspective. And through that, building the relationships and the collaborations with like-minded businesses that quite often are not just out of the energy sector, but in technology sectors and also other sectors, across the world, whether they be, from defence right the way through to the high-tech sectors and consumer-centric businesses. Flip to the next slide. So just to give an illustration of how we land on their Symphony strategy, very much started in our thinking with regards to our electricity network, and then how that's actually brought to life with regards to anything from policy development, regulation, what is the needs that we see for regulation, right through to technology and development. So our analysis, which we do for our asset management planning, was first and foremost starts with scenarios, and those scenarios really were focused on what is the future going to look like over the next 10 plus years. And that future in New Zealand, whilst we're blessed with you know, a high percentage of renewable energy in New Zealand, the flip side of that is what happens when a lot of the customers want to, for example, you know, put solar on, or they want other solutions such as being able to charge their electric vehicles, or what happens if the government changes its policy about how do we decarbonise the transport sector, or how do we actually change the industrial processing of heat from, you know, gas, for example. So the scenarios that we developed is essentially three kind of scenarios. One, which is where Symphony is all about, if we can actually control those expected kind of uptakes of things such as solar and also electric vehicles, and we can provide control environments that still give the customer the full experience with regards to being able to utilize their solar or discharge their batteries to ensure that their costs are managed, or they want to charge their electric vehicles. That's essentially the Symphony model. And then it actually looks at, well, therefore, what kind of cost does that actually require to actually have the control systems, but also manage the upgrades of the network and what we call the more traditional assets, so more capacity put into our network. POP is kind of almost like a little bit of a halfway, where some's controlled and some's not. And actually, the ROC scenario is essentially where it's an uncontrolled environment. So essentially, it's customers put in EVs, charging networks, they put in solar, they put in discharging batteries and everything, and all we do is respond to that by actually building more capacity. So from that lens, we obviously look at that as a suboptimal outcome. It's suboptimal in the sense that it's deploying a lot of capital. It potentially creates an environment where customer service and solutions may be compromised because it's not orchestrated in a smart way, where I'm sure many of you had situations where it's either a lot of solar overloads or other issues like that are arising on the networks. And so this is why we've really invested in technologies such as IoT, DRES platforms, control systems, and then the customer interface, so that we can harmonize those two worlds together, so the customer still gets the service and the outcomes, but it doesn't create the collateral damage of significant investment in the network, and therefore a lot of sunk assets which materialize in higher costs, which spiral into affordability issues for consumers, but also the other side being a massive stranding asset risk and a funding risk from being able to deploy those assets across Auckland. And so there's a lot of sophisticated analysis went into this. And what you'll see there is all our network catchment area deconstructed into colour codes, which is essentially what we call our zone substation area, or the community supply areas. And where the red is identified, that's where we would need to put in some upgrades. And then obviously green is where we wouldn't need to upgrade, because we can manage the peaks based on the growth and actually controlling those kind of load profiles. And as you can see, there's a massive difference between the Symphony and the ROC scenario. And so that's why we focus on Symphony as an outcome that's best for consumers, still enables their solutions to be delivered, but it also mitigates a lot of those risks such as network overloads and also customer experience. And we'll talk to how we therefore provide that solution. Now, next slide is actually interesting when we go into the customer insights that inform this. So what we have access to is electric vehicle registrations across Auckland. And again, we map all those on our systems and identify where we have high density of electric vehicles being purchased and therefore requiring charging versus areas that don't. And obviously that informs us of local capacity issues. What are the behaviours of those electric vehicle customers? How are their charging instances? Are they similar, or do they operate differently? And we've done a project just over the last 6 months with observing pre-lockdown and post-lockdown. What are the behaviours of charging behaviours changing like? What are the load profiles changing like? But importantly, what it also means is that we can feed this information into the regulatory debate and also the political debate in New Zealand about electric vehicles and the transition to decarbonising New Zealand. But representing here where there's high penetrations and understanding why there's high penetrations of electric vehicles, but also really importantly, also identifying where there's low penetrations, and those low penetrations typically arise in lower socioeconomic areas where people can't afford electric vehicles, and also obviously many of them are not in their own homes. And why this is important, because the way in which our pricing has to be constructed is that it's a uniform price right across Auckland. So the issue that we obviously debate here with our regulators and policymakers is that by virtue of electric vehicles going in that could require upgrades to parts of the network, it's inequitable that areas of Auckland that can't afford electric vehicles, those costs get socialised across them, and they end up actually in a worse spiral from an affordability perspective. And therefore, that is a conversation that needs to be had about how do you firstly lower the impact of those network upgrades, to go to the Symphony story as opposed to the Rock story, and therefore lower the upgrade costs. And then the second layer is how do we actually need to think differently about pricing to different communities across Auckland with regards to the cost causation type of issues. The next slide is then looking at this through another lens, and this is what we run from our census data in New Zealand, and it's basically from census, but also we overload all the housing data across Auckland and look at this and what is going on with regards to the way in which consumers across Auckland are using energy differently. What type of house do they have? What are the characteristics of that house? For example, insulation versus not, what appliances they have in it. We have access to all that data as well as all the network data and quite a number of other sources of data. And again, for this is looking at what we call a deprivation index. So the darker the box, that's the lower socioeconomic areas, and the lighter the colour is, that's the more wealthy areas across Auckland. And what this is very important to also bring into the conversation, not only from focus internally from a customer focus, is, well, how do we actually make sure that we're continually delivering lower cost solutions that still meet the right requirements without burdening all those customers? And equally at the same time, in the deprivation areas, we can observe what's going on with energy efficiency. And so we know that the lower socioeconomic areas are basically about a fourth, or areas there's more wealthier areas are basically reducing their energy consumption at a rate of about 20% faster than the lower socioeconomic areas. And from a government policy and community perspective, that's really critical information to support why we need to invest in these solutions and these systems to focus on affordability, focus on decarbonisation, but importantly focus on the service and building an affordable networks for consumers. There's multiple other examples of these, but we just thought that might be a couple of points that was of relevance. Just turning to the next slide. One of our businesses is PowerSmart, Vector PowerSmart. We deploy solar and battery projects across the Pacific and also New Zealand and Australia. Primarily in Australia, we've only done one over in Australia, but we still have a number of others that are still in train across the Pacific. And one of the current challenges there is obviously we can't challenge to many of these locations where we've got more projects to deliver, but also certainly across New Zealand. New Zealand, we've delivered a 1 megawatt floating solar solution just recently on what was a sewage treatment ponds in Auckland, where that then provides the power to basically manage all the pumping, and also any excess goes back into the grid. We've put a large-scale solar system on a large wine growing company here in Auckland, as well as multiple other industrial businesses. But the important other aspects is we've built microgrids as a lower cost solution than upgrading our own network in New Zealand. And that experience has come from the fact that throughout the Pacific, we've done a lot of solar and battery projects whereby we're taking those island solutions off diesel through their desires to decarbonise their economies and put them onto solar and battery solutions. So as you can see, there's a significant amount of activity that we've been involved in across the Pacific through our separate business known as Vector PowerSmart. Next slide is, I'll hand over now to Nicole, and Nicole will talk through about the digital kind of element and how we architect that and the business model for architecting that, particularly through what we call Vector Technology Services, which is an unregulated business where we provide services not to only Vector, but to other parties in New Zealand and further afield. So, Nicole.
Thank you, Simon. So as Simon was mentioning, core to our Symphony strategy is our ability to interact and do so in almost real time with what's happening at the customer end of the equation. And a lot of these interactions are facilitated by digital platforms. And the distinction I'd like to make here is between what I call, if you will, generation one IT applications that we've utilized until this point versus digital platforms that are based on, for lack of a better term, exponential technology or technology such as IoT, big data analytics, AI, machine learning, and also rely on high bandwidth connectivity and high quality connectivity services. And these platforms aren't necessarily always available off the shelf and need to be constructed or assembled to help deliver our Symphony strategy. And we've done that by leveraging the internal capability we have, and we've grown that internal capability. So within the Vector Group now, alongside engineering competency, there's also a team with fairly in-depth digital competency that's being developed. But also equally important for us has been partnerships with like-minded organizations where these building block services exist, but also organizations where there's a cultural alignment in terms of how we go about constructing some of these platforms. That's led to, and this is a bit more of an illustrative view, I suppose, but has led to sort of three main platforms that underpin our Symphony strategy. At the bottom layer, and I think one that is getting a lot of airtime and absolutely deserves so, is our ITOT cybersecurity capability, and it's getting airtime around the world for very good reason. But the moment we go beyond sort of the legacy boundaries of where we've operated and start to interact with systems or devices that are beyond the edge of those boundaries, then we are opening ourselves up to potential vulnerabilities as far as cyber is concerned. So I thought best we start there. It's not always the most glamorous parts of what the digital platform, but I think it's one of the most critical parts of the platform. So what we've done over the last few years is develop a very focused IT and OT critical infrastructure cyber capability. And that's been built, again, through some of our own internal resources, but through partnerships with some of the leaders in this space out of the United States and places like Israel. And everything we do from a digital domain plugs into that capability, and the capability ends up becoming an enabler of our change and the digital platforms that we have. Logically, I suppose we can then split our underlying Symphony enablement platforms into two. One that we refer to as our grid optimization platform, and the other that we refer to as the new energy platform. And I'll talk about that at a high level and bring that to life a bit more with a couple of examples. On the left-hand side, the grid optimization platform is at the core a IoT and data processing engine. So collecting as much information from deployed sensors and information coming out from the edge into those platforms, and with the ability to process that information, create simulations, and where we have control mechanisms available, orchestrate outcomes. So that's the core capability within that platform, and it's made up of connectivity services. So we have very close relationships with our two large telecommunications providers here around 4G and 5G IoT technologies in particular, and leveraging our own fiber assets that we have as part of Vector Fiber. The other ingredient that goes into this is obviously IoT capability, advanced analytics, including machine learning and AI capability, as well as the ability to then provide orchestration over the top, sometimes branded as creating digital twins of our physical assets, if you will. On top of that, we call it grid optimization apps, but isn't necessarily the types of apps you would put on your iPhone, I suppose. But these are interconnected systems, but all serving a very core purpose within the narrative of enabling Symphony. So we are spending a lot of time focused on deploying these technologies around solving our field issues, so creating a smarter field force. We're also using the same technology building blocks to change the way asset management planning is done from a very manual, static sort of model to, as Simon previously discussed, a very dynamic and scenario-based and data-driven model where we're looking at very localized impacts and taking that into account when we are developing our asset management plans. We've also had to look at sort of parallel industries and leverage some of that capability to develop platforms such as the DRES platform. And DRES obviously is a very critical, or distributed energy resource management is obviously a very critical enablement of Symphony, and that's a core pillar to Symphony. And without that, you're essentially, being pushed towards the ROC scenario. And the DRES platform comes from a defense side through a company called DRES out of Israel. And what we found in the DRES space was it was either a nice to have feature on sort of the traditional platform providers roadmaps, or it was developed as a very niche application by smaller players who are focused more on microgrids and VPP enablement and so on. But what we were looking for is a platform that actually integrated with the core network operations of the distribution network and was reacting to changes on the ground, such as switching and so on, in real time. So I'll talk about that a bit more. ADMS as a service might, on the face of it, seem like much more of a traditional capability, and we are working with GE on that. But with GE, we have constructed a sort of world's first arrangement where we take the standard GE ADMS platform and we integrate it with the grid optimization platform. And we have the ability to then, on a public cloud type infrastructure, so with hyperscale capability, with the ability to overlay cybersecurity services, then multi-tenant that platform to not just Vector's needs, but also other EDBs in our region, for example. The other challenge that we're looking at is DER certification and making sure that the distribution network isn't seen as a constraining factor in that process, and we can enable and in some cases accelerate adoption where it makes sense. So that's on the grid optimization side. We also are focused on leveraging our set of assets to help enable a new market construct, if you will, or at least help modernize the way the energy markets operate at the moment. And that's really the focus of the new energy platform. And at the core of that is making sure that we can really help fulfill the promise of smart metering. Today, smart metering is really fundamentally only used for retail billing purposes. And we, as one of the largest smart metering providers or advanced metering providers in the region, we believe that it can support a lot more of the use cases. And so the new energy platform is a partnership with AWS, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the first of the apps, if you will, that we're targeting there is the meter information management platform. And we have services that are on the roadmap there that really are focused around ensuring that in a Symphony world, through the right cyber protection frameworks, privacy management and controls, we do enable customers to provide their energy usage information and their smart metering data on a open data access basis to people who are helping them solve their energy challenges. And so we look at the new energy platform as an enablement platform to get to that end outcome. So just in terms of, Simon, did you want to add anything further on this slide?
No, I think very much just on that slide, we've touched on our strategic alliance with Amazon Web Services shortly, but really important just to recognise that this platform that we're talking about with AWS is really identified about how do we deliver solutions to customers, being our retailers, so they can then in turn provide their solutions to their customers. As well as at the same time, we're seeing a trend here, and I'm sure it's the same in many other jurisdictions where other parties such as network operators are seeking consumption and network information from smart meters, but equally seeing regulators really start saying, well, other parties should be able to access that information if the customer gives approval and if they meet all the regulatory requirements. We're not selling data. What we're selling is the functionality and the service of a platform that can deliver really beneficial outcomes to those customers through analytics and processing capacity, which is replacing a lot of old legacy systems that are just insufficient in capability to take us forward into the future. So it's probably a good segue for you, Nicol.
It is, thank you. And as I mentioned, the new energy platform is something we are collaborating very closely with Amazon Web Services on. It's under the construct of a strategic alliance, and Amazon Web Services have a handful of these across multiple different industry verticals, and this is the first of its kind anywhere globally in the energy sector. And really what the initial focus is the development of a multi-fuel, what we call meter information management platform. Today, the meter information management part of the sort of digital architecture is provided by large monolithic application stacks, which are fairly inflexible and fairly expensive in terms of being able to meet the sort of changing needs of that part of the digital stack. So what we've decided to do here is to address that problem head on, and we have a lot of experience, extensive experience in this space, having been an operator of advanced metering services. So just to give you a couple of data points, just across New Zealand, and it is a sort of deregulated market with multiple players. We, our 1.4 million sort of meter base, for example, as a sample, on the current model, used to take 29 hours for us to process that data for a daily bill run. With 24 hours in a day, that's obviously, a challenging prospect. And that's just not performance that's good enough as markets move from, in the case of Australia, moving from a 30-minute market to a 5-minute market settlement model. So at the moment on the MEP, using these building block services that I referred to previously, we are now processing 80 million meters worth of data on the New Zealand market model in under 40 minutes. And it's that type of a performance uplift that we're targeting in terms of what we're trying to achieve as part of the new energy platform, and in particular the MIP. And again, going back to the platform and the App Store analogy, the MIP is one of multiple applications that we're planning to develop to target such use cases where the current technology constraints are holding back the full potential of what can be achieved. The other point I would make in terms of market enablement, alongside the new energy platform, we're also running a series of sort of market trials to understand what the market would have to look like in a Symphony world. So just an example of that is in Israel, we're working with a kibbutz where we have essentially hired the kibbutz for a period of time and overlaid our New Zealand market model. And this kibbutz has about 8,000 endpoints and a very high penetration of new technology and such as renewable generation at the edge, storage, including pump storage sites, EV penetration, and so on. And we're deploying bots within that community to autonomously trade power before entering into the main market, to understand what the efficiency gains are when you move to a sort of almost real-time model where it's not the end customer who's making decisions, but it's actually the bots who are acting as the agents of the end customer, trading on a very dynamic market environment. And that's feeding into the roadmaps of our main platforms and helping us understand what this new energy future could look like. Another example, but this time around from the grid optimization side, I briefly touched upon our partnership with Emprest in the development of the DRES platform. And what we've done here is developed a distributed energy resource management platform, leveraging industrial IoT capability that came out of the defense sector, and overlaid that on top of our city grid to turn the grid from less of a sort of transportation mechanism for energy to more of an energy trading marketplace in real time. So we have essentially interconnected with the grid all of the distributed energy resources that are currently connected into the Auckland grid. And that includes EVs, EV chargers, public chargers, even our hot water cylinders in a residential context, our grid scale batteries, the microgrids. And that essentially gives us the ability to manage that flexibility to fulfill multiple different use cases. One of the features of this, as I mentioned previously, is that this topology is a real-time representation of the network. So in an outage scenario, if a particular part of the network has been switched, that level of flexibility from the DRES on that network is encountered into whatever real-time actions that the platform's helping us take. The other feature of the platform obviously is using sort of machine learning techniques. It allows us to forecast ahead and plan how we would best utilize the DRES flexibility and then be able to act on that ahead of time. So that's another example of a sort of Symphony enablement platform that we've been focused on developing. This is a little bit of a flyby update, and there's a lot that sits under the cover. So if anyone's interested in any more information, Lawrence has our details, obviously, and we can dive deeper into it. The other thing I would say is all of this is only possible through collaboration on real environments. So we're always very keen to talk to like-minded folk and see if there's opportunities to collaborate further on these platforms as well. So it would be great to have those conversations if anyone's interested. Thank you. I'll hand back to Simon.
Thanks, Nicol. And look, just lastly, I guess one of the other aspects which we really focus on here and puts it in stark relief is essentially we do have carbon targets from a global perspective. We have carbon targets from a New Zealand perspective set by our government, and we also have our own internal carbon targets. And it's a real pillar of our sustainability positioning around how do we participate in the challenges that are required not only in New Zealand but also globally to meet that carbon reduction. Obviously a big impact with regards to the decarbonisation of transport, but also how do we look at that through that lens of customer and also affordability. And I think what's just to end is a really important context here is we very much look at this challenge through the lens of what is the rate of change. And so this graph is actually a representation of New Zealand. It's done by one of our partners, and it's basically a really strong representation around as the years progress towards the need to reduce the carbon reductions by 2030. The blue lines obviously show what is the abatement required to start mitigating the carbon levels to get to the carbon zero target. And obviously as we progress from 1980 to 2020 to 2030 is the vertical line, it essentially shows that those curves steepen, so the rate of change has to increase significantly. And why is this relevant? Well, we think it's not only relevant from the challenge in front of us, and it's really important for everyone in the business to think about it and globally, but we also see that in the future, and I guess COVID is a kind of an adjacent view into this, is what happens when we're faced with massive challenges, that we don't always see market outcomes being the ones that will deliver, and the return into mandated outcomes or regulatory outcomes or government policy which just said, sorry, we don't have, the market's not delivering at the rate of change that we need, so we need to move over to dictating outcomes or basically setting policy which forces outcomes. And in New Zealand we've had some of that where there's been a ban on oil and gas exploration, for example. So we see that's really relevant because not only in New Zealand but also globally, that's going to, not only from a market but also a mandating perspective, it's going to increase the rate of change of technology, but also those curves probably also represent the urgency that companies are going to have to act, and also consumer expectations are going to follow with regards to what their expectations are about finding solutions. So we just wanted to leave it on that note and recognise that that is a very important part that we see from New Zealand, but also globally, and what's going to drive significant change from a consumer and also political regulatory setting perspective.
Thank you, Simon. And Nick, I think you guys covered quite a bit, and we have a few minutes here left to try to get in some questions. And what I would do is I would just ask one question, but because we have a small audience, normally we have a much bigger, but because of the time difference, I would welcome those on the call who may have questions. Is there a way, Vanessa, to ask folks to get unleashed, or not unleashed, to get unmuted to ask the question directly? That would be great, because I think I see a few CEOs on the call as well who may want to ask questions. I see Jay from Manitoba Hydro and Greg from Wellington Electricity and others. So just to kick things off here, one quick question from my side here is, Simon, can you talk a little bit about the issue of the, you talk about social compact and you talk about the sort of a net zero targets and the regulatory construct. To what extent are your regulators perhaps more innovative in terms of their thinking? Because what you're trying to do here is very, very transformative. And in some parts of the world, there is regulatory resistance to making these kinds of investments in technology going forward. So what are your regulators seeing that other regulators are not seeing? And what can we learn from your regulators that would have them embrace this kind of innovative approach to changing the world, if you may?
I think there's two parts to that, Lawrence. I think there's one part where our regulators, particularly the Electricity Authority, has seen the value of new technology and recognising that that creates benefits. So they haven't put in constraints, like, for example, saying that we couldn't invest in certain types of technology because it doesn't sit within the regulated frameworks for like a distribution business. But I think the other aspect is that we actually take the view that we want to go out and deploy these solutions. A lot of the regulatory constructs are written historically, and they don't kind of contemplate these solutions. And where we're really focusing on is identifying how they're delivering benefits to consumers, how they're focusing on reducing challenges such as, you know, decarbonisation. So putting out electric vehicle charging infrastructure across Auckland is obviously in line with government policy. It's in line with the Auckland City Council objectives about decarbonisation. So collaboration with parties like the Auckland City Council to say, well, this is what we need in Auckland. We need charging infrastructure. So being able to deploy those assets, they were also partially funded by our community ownership model as well, to say, well, they also see the benefit of this across New Zealand. So I think it's about acting fast. And also the other side is, you'll see there that we structure our business differently. So we have vector technology services and other unregulated parts of our business that are providing solutions into our regulated businesses, rather than the regulated business providing that solution. And you know, that's allowed within the regulatory construct here as well.
Interesting you bring up the distinction between regulated and unregulated business. I want to talk a little bit about the fact that you're dealing with multiple technology providers. You got GE, you got Impress, you got AWS. Can you talk a little bit about intellectual property of solutions? Because one of the challenges we see as a utility sector is we have a lot of innovation that we do, but we normally do not commercialize our innovation. And looking at some of the companies on the call today, they themselves have a lot of innovation they're doing. So can you talk about intellectual property when you're working with the likes of Amazon and GE? How does Vector secure its intellectual property for the value you're adding to this process?
Yeah, I think it's two parts. It's very much, first and foremost, you know, our approach is very much, we have to work with like-minded parties, and you know, we also bring I guess, you know, if we look at the case of AWS as an example, where they did a lot of due diligence on us, we'd obviously been storing a lot of information up in the AWS cloud from a smart management perspective, but that was just basically metering data. We developed a lot of the Impress kind of storage and solutions on the AWS platform using their building blocks. And from that, when we had the conversation with them about how do we co-develop some of the future requirements, they did a lot of, you know, due diligence and understanding Vector and looking at the culture. And I think that's a really important part that many people think is that, you know, you have to turn up with the right culture and the right mindset and the right objective, as opposed to, you know, looking like you're going to, you know, block the future. And one of the other attributes we bring is that we actually, you know, invest in those relationships. We develop the platforms together, and then we deploy them through a model which is about how do we first and foremost have those platforms delivering to our needs, and then in conjunction with those partners, how can we then actually market those, you know, globally. And so that's part of the mix. And Nicole, you might be best placed just to talk about the IP, but it's in all our contractual arrangement, it's really clearly identified about how do we manage each other's IP, and where it's been jointly developed, how do we actually commercialize that, as well as share in the benefits of it.
Absolutely, Simon. I mean, more and more, I think we as operators will create IP because a lot of what we're developing now is based on sort of building blocks, but the actual utility comes from the assembly of those building blocks, where historically we've gone to a tier one vendor and bought one of these systems, and really just what we have had to do is plug that into our environment. And now I think it's more important to understand the architecture and where we want to capture that value, and then what IP is worth protecting and what's not. The other aspect of IP, I think, is more and more we as operators get to capture and productize that IP, but also trade it, you know, because we have common challenges, and I think that will require much more of a collaboration mindset to be able to not just see ourselves as sort of procurers of technology that we just connect into our environments, but actually what's the role of that type of technology? What's the additional value that's actually needed that we can now build through these building block services? And how do we then make sure that the IP is managed appropriately at that point? So alongside the ability to create all of these platforms is a need to be a lot more sophisticated around how we procure and manage IP going into the future, in my opinion.
Yeah, just one thing. Sorry, Lawrence, just one thing to add there. Sorry, just really briefly. We also, again, in that space of IP, we search for parties that have the depth of experience that we need. So advisors, you know, in legal, but in IP, but also we have very strong relationships with people, for example, in Silicon Valley that have a huge depth of experience in these commercial constructs, and those relationships are really critical when we're working with other parties to put these arrangements together.
So when you look at the profile of Vector in your introductory slide, you are involved in Australia, you have multiple businesses, regulated, non-regulated. Given where the world is right now, do you see the non-regulated arm of your business as the engine for growth going forward as we see some reduction in demand around the world? Do you think this is a model that more and more companies will look to for top line growth, where you look at the non-regulated business as the area for growth?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think, you know, that has to be managed within our operating capital structure requirements, which is obviously to maintain credit ratings, and those credit ratings also have a mix of regulated, unregulated kind of dimensions that have to be considered, and what is the risk profile of those unregulated businesses. So that's something that we work very closely with the rating agencies on. A lot of the requirements are to ensure that those rating agencies and capital providers understand the risk profile and the characteristics of those businesses. I think one of the realities too, though, is when we look at it from an efficient use of capital and a capital allocation, you know, the big issue now facing, I guess, a lot of regulated utilities globally is with interest rates essentially being, you know, a key determinant into weighted average cost of capitalism. With those dropping so significantly, how do you deploy your capital to get the best outcomes? And for us, that means we're changing the way in which we think about the way in which we invest into our regulated businesses, because, you know, simply faced with a better return from unregulated versus regulated, then how do we optimize that outcome? Clearly still have to deliver on the services to customers, but you know, being able to build those unregulated businesses that, you know, against what I'd say is the traditional high intensity of capital going into networks. I mean, Auckland has a very, very high growth kind of characteristics. It's one of the fastest growing Western cities globally. So managing that at the same time of deploying capital efficiently into the unregulated business, showing how we deploy these platforms, and then collaborating with those companies that we're in alliances with to sell those applications and services globally is how we look at the future, and definitely will lead to, you know, probably much more proportional unregulated growth versus the regulated growth from a financial outcome perspective.
I have one last question. It has to do with metrics. I know you guys are big on analytics. I've been to Vector many times, and I know some of your folks are deep into analytics. KPIs is one thing that regulators love to see, right? So to know how you're going to measure the performance of the company. So given all these investments you're making using data analytics, are you coming up with new sets of KPIs that regulators should be looking at or are looking at, where the traditional Sadie, Katie are sort of moving away? Now we need to start looking in a digital world. What kinds of KPIs are utilities going to be using as they justify making investments in more and more digital technology, not necessarily for reliability, but for dealing with things like, you know, net zero emissions, dealing with things like resilience? What are some of the new KPIs you see emerging from the work you guys have been doing?
Yeah, great question. I think first and foremost, what I call the baseline of regulatory outcomes is utilization. And I think, you know, that comes down into what is the asset management philosophy, how are you investing in the assets from capital deployed. And, I think there's a lot of businesses that will really struggle in deploying assets in what I call a very traditional kind of deterministic mindset. So I think that utilization will naturally be a real focus on in the future from a regulator, because it looks at that capital efficiency and how do you get the best use out of the assets whilst delivering to customers. And that's essentially what we see as the symphony versus pop versus rock type of scenario. A massive capital cost difference, which gives a price difference, which gives, that utilization difference is really what rock, pop and symphony is about. I think the other aspect to your point around carbon efficiency and everything, one of the areas the team's really focused on is not just measuring carbon footprint, but it's carbon handprint. And so carbon handprint being what are the ways in which we're investing in solutions and products to customers that enable those customers to decarbonize their solutions. So things such as solar, such as batteries, such as electric vehicle charging. So all those actually are not carbon benefits that we can capture, but they're what we call the carbon handprint, which is it's a relatively newish concept globally, but I think that's a really important metric that'll have to be considered, as saying, well, how does your design of your network, your management, your thinking about your network enable those other consumers to think about how they're going to benefit and be able to utilize services? And then in the SAIDI kind of debate, well, yeah, we very much believe that the whole network should be deconstructed down into characteristics of the same type: overhead, underground, types of customers, remote, urban. And with the analytics that we can put over that, is rather than having some kind of macro kind of target, then it has to be a much more micro kind of clustered targets, with also more proactive payment to customers. If we haven't met a service level, then that we proactively pay the customer, rather than actually a customer having to wait and actually never see, in the case of New Zealand, never see any kind of payment made to them for a lack of meeting the service standard. In fact, if we don't meet that, the payments typically go into a regulatory fine, and the regulatory fine sits within the government payment system, and it doesn't find its way back to customers. So we think a customer-centric world has to have the tools and capabilities to measure those outcomes, to identify where there's problems on the systems, pay customers almost within a month, say, for example, of that service experience not being up to standard, is just a few examples of how we look at it. But those three layers are probably how we cluster that up with customer outcomes through SAIDI, but at a micro level.
I think Simon and Nick, you've proven what I've always said, that even though New Zealand is far away, I've been there many times, it's really far away, you have the ability to also shape the world in terms of some of the innovative things you do. And I think this presentation, your work you're doing on these different scenarios, clearly sort of stipulates that thought there. The other point I will make as we wrap this up is that the point you brought up about handprints and these new metrics, we certainly want to welcome you at some point back to talk to the folks, because I think this is an area where a lot of regulators around the world are struggling in terms of understanding how do they regulate infrastructure assets going forward in a consumer-centric world. And I think because there's a huge, in the US, for example, I can say that we're looking at significant investments in grid infrastructure over the next 5, 10, 15 years. The challenge facing the industry is that regulators are still stuck in the old world view of how they will analyze the performance of electric companies. The same in Europe, the same in many other parts of the world. So you guys are on the cutting edge in New Zealand in terms of looking at how to deal with that. So your size should not intimidate you in terms of trying to change the world, but I would certainly welcome you guys back at some point to talk about the analytics aspect of your work, because I think there will be a lot of interest in knowing the kinds of metrics. So really appreciate you all doing this. Again, this has been a great conversation, and we're happy to have had people on the call from Canada, from Germany, and the US and New Zealand to hear these remarks. So thank you all so much. I wish I could come back to New Zealand in the next 2 months, but it looks like that's not going to happen. So once things settle down, I look forward to coming back. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Vanessa for any housekeeping closing thoughts before we end. Vanessa?
Thank you, Lawrence. And thank you, Simon and Nikhil, for this great presentation. Thank you to everyone for joining today's webinar. We really hope you found the discussion valuable and insightful. We will send out the webinar presentation and a recording to all attendees, and we look forward to your attendance at our future webinars and virtual events. To
And I
continue,
should also say, Vanessa, oh, I'm sorry, but I forgot. If anyone on this call, because I know a few people may have questions, would like to get in touch with Simon and Nikhil directly, just let us know. We can put you in touch with them, because I'm sure there are some follow-up questions from here. So
yes, definitely. You can email international@eei.org if you would like to be put in touch with any of the speakers. To continue engaging with EEI International programs and to learn about other upcoming events, please follow us on Twitter or visit our website, which I've added in the chat. And besides that, thank you again and have a wonderful rest of your day.
thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you
Thanks
so
a
much.
lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.